Behold, the door of mixing wisdom. And in this video, this door is going to reveal 4 mixing secrets I wish I learned a lot sooner. And in fact, I'm a little embarrassed I didn't know about these in my first year of mixing. So mixing secret number 1. Top-down mixing. Top-down mixing is the concept of starting at the master bus and working your way down, putting all the drums into a bus, putting all the vocals into a bus, putting things into buses, and then starting at the bus level and then working down to the individual track level. The reason this works so well is because you're actually gluing elements together. You're also saving a ton of processing power because you're not loading a bunch of plugins. You're also able to work significantly faster because you're adding less plugins, doing less work. The majority of the work is setting up all the buses and all the routing. This kind of emulates how it used to be back in the day when we only had like 8 channels. Then when channels started to grow, we were able to have a little bit more freedom and flexibility, but still a lot of things had to be rendered to certain areas. They were recorded directly to tape. And if you only had 8 channels, well, you couldn't have 12 different microphones recording the drum kit. You were a bit limited, but because of that limitation, things got super creative and things sounded really great. And so I love top-down mixing, and a lot of really fantastic engineers use it, like Nolly. So let me show you this in action.
So let's start right off with the master bus and adding compression on the master bus. This is also called mix bus compression or 2-bus compression, however you want to call it. It's essentially your main bus out is where you add plugins. So if we quickly take a look here, I have some mixed bus compression going on here using the FG Gray. And what I'm looking for is around 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction. And I mix into this compressor. So if things are a little too loud, I can hear that compressor's pumping and I'll turn everything down. If it's a little too quiet and I want it to smash that compressor a little bit more, I'll turn it back up. This is super helpful because now I have an end goal in mind. I know how things are going to sound once it's mastered. Notice how that just comes into your face just a little bit more. Things are a lot more loud, a lot more present, especially the guitars. This makes a big difference, especially because if I didn't have this compressor on, I probably would have turned the guitars up a little bit too loud, and then they would have poked through a little bit more once the compression was on. So I always like starting at the master bus and working my way down.
Mixing secret 1, done. Mixing secret number 2. Multiband processing. You've probably heard of multiband compression. This is a similar thing, but I'm talking about multiband processing, where you can do, where goes that stick? But multiband processing is where you can add different types of processing to individual bands. You could add saturation just to the low end, or compression just to the low end, or you could add reverbs and delays just to certain frequencies. I really love doing this on bass guitar, where I'm able to solo out just the low end, compress it, make it sound really nice and full, but then take the top end of that bass track and add some saturation, some distortion, and really kind of get that to set in the mix. So I have 2 different parallel bass tracks. You could do this manually by copying and pasting down different channels in your DAW, or you can use plugins like Multipass, which allow you to add plugins to the individual bands without having to manually split the bands yourself. Either way, it's a fantastic technique I highly recommend you use. So let me show you how it works in the DAW.
In order to multiband something, all you need to do is really duplicate the track down, bring your audio down as well, and then you can actually just put an EQ soloing out different frequencies. So I will put a hard cut right around 1K, and then I could do the opposite for the other track. But there are other plugins that allow you to do this in a more easy and simple way. But if you don't have these kind of plugins, don't worry about it. You could still use that trick that I showed you there. You could solo out the low end, solo out the mid-range, solo out the high end, and adjust each one independently of one another. But one of my favorite plugins for this is called Multipass, which allows you to put plugins on specific frequencies that you select. And you can set up to 5 different zones here. And one of my favorite things to do is to add a little bit of saturation onto the low end or to the mid-range of some drums. So I can add just a little bit of some overdrive here, and I can distort the low end without affecting the sound quality of the cymbals. And it doesn't need to just stop at some overdrive or some compression. You can add reverb to certain frequencies. You can add delay to certain frequencies. There's tons of stuff that you can do just by splitting the bands out. Multipass is one of my favorite ways to do it, but you can do this manually inside of your DAW as well.
Mixing secret number 2, done. Now, mixing secret number 3, parallel processing. Now, this is different than multi-band processing because you're not processing individual bands. You're actually processing everything. You've probably heard of parallel compression. I really like this parallel compression on drums, but you don't have to stop at compression. You can parallel process anything at all, and you can use any type of plugin that you want. All you do is create a bus in your DAW, and you throw whatever plugin you want onto that bus and route whatever instrument you want to that bus. For example, I like to add drums to a drum compression bus and add parallel compression to that. You can also just use the mix knob on any plugin at all, and that does a similar thing. But the concept remains the same. You have your signal, and you have a split signal that you're processing separately, and they run in parallel. So let me show you how this works in the DAW.
First up is the simple mix knob trick, where you can just blend anything in with a mix knob, which essentially creates two different versions of that sound. So 100% compressed, and the other one that is completely dry. This mix knob is blending that compressed signal in with the uncompressed signal. The other thing that you could do is you could just create a bus and add plugins just to that bus and then blend it in with that bus. So it splits the channel out into two. One of my favorite things to do with parallel processing is, of course, parallel compression. So listen to these drums here. They sound pretty good, but they could use a little bit more of a punch. To get a little bit more of a punch out of it, I'm going to use some parallel compression. And so with the compressor all the way up to mixes 100% wet, I'm going to set this to the nuke setting, and I'm just going to start adjusting the input, attack, and release until I'm getting a significant amount of like punch and slap back to these drums. So I'm getting a significant amount of compression there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the mix knob all the way back, and I'm going to slowly blend it in with these drums. So much better. Listen to the snare and listen to how it actually sustains out longer. That makes a massive difference. Now, once again, just like in the last one, you don't need to stop at compression. You can parallel process anything you want. And another thing that I really love doing is adding some parallel saturation. So listen to this guitar here. It's sounding pretty good, but I want a little bit more saturation out of that guitar. I want it to sit in the mix just a bit brighter, and I want it to be just a tad bit louder. And so adding some parallel saturation to this can actually really make it stand out in the mix just a little bit more. Here I have an instance of the Virtual Tube collection from Slate Digital, and I'm just going to turn the mix all the way up, really start cranking the saturation until I'm getting a decent amount of top end out of this, and then I'm going to dial it back with the mix knob. So mix knob all the way up. Let's start working on some saturation. Now that's sounding really good, but I want to kind of bring it back just a touch because I don't necessarily want all of that saturation in there. I can kind of get a little bit muddy and can kind of get a little bit warbly if I'm not careful. So blending that in alongside the unprocessed signal is going to help a ton. Already so much better. I'm getting the clarity from the unprocessed signal, but I'm also getting that saturation and grit and drive from the processed signal. And blending them in parallel is helping a ton.
Mixing secret number 3, done! Now the final mixing tip is number 4, but before I get to that, I do want to mention that this video is sponsored by yours truly. I don't have a single sponsor, but if you like the content you're watching so far, you're really gonna love my free masterclass on mixing, recording, and producing vocals. It's absolutely free. It's about 45 minutes long, and it goes extremely in-depth into the recording process, the mixing process, adding creative effects so that way your vocals don't sound like they're awkwardly sitting alongside the rest of the track. And I go into the 3 secrets of mixing vocals, so that way your vocals can sound professional no matter where you're at, even if you don't have acoustic treatment in your room. You can watch that for free. The link will be down in the description below and in the pinned comment, just in case you miss it. I spent multiple months building it, and I promise it's gonna be worth every single bit of your time. Now finally, mixing secret number 4. Anything is a pedal. Now let me explain exactly what I mean. I'm sure you're somewhat aware of guitar pedals. These are specific little boxes similar to plugins. They do one thing, whether that's EQ, or compression or saturation, distortion, overdrive, any type of thing, it does basically one specific task. Now, because we have amp sims, we can actually put anything we want before the amp, creating our own pedal board with plugins that aren't typically used for pedals. I really love using like an 1176 or an LA2A to kind of hit the compression of the DI before it goes into the amp. But there's multiple things that you can do besides just that. Things that used to seemingly be impossible is now possible because of the ability to use amp sims and reamp things. So let me show you one of my favorite tricks inside of the DAW.
So it doesn't matter what it is. If it's a plugin, it can technically be a pedal because we can put it before our amp sim or before our reamp box in our software. So let me bring up multipass. So this is kind of an additional trick two where we're using some multiband processing, but we're adding this before our amp sim. So let me drag this before the amp sim. So here we have the amp sim, here we have some mixing plugins, and I'm gonna turn everything off here except for multipass. So now you're gonna hear just the normal DI. And so what I want to do is I want to add some distortion on the top end of this. So I don't want to distort anything down here. I just want to distort this top end and get some clarity right around 3K and above. Notice how that pick attack kind of starts to poke through a little bit. Now this running into our amp is going to make a massive difference on the clarity of that pick attack and everything else going through. Just kind of gets it to poke through in the mix just a little bit more. Top it off with some mixing.
Mixing tip number 4, done. Now, all of those mixing tips actually stem from one basic mixing concept. In fact, every mixing tip that you find on the internet stems down from a single mixing concept. And once you understand this, mixes become easy. If you want to know more on what I'm talking about, you can just click on this video right here. In that video, I explain exactly what that one mixing concept is and how you can use it in your next mix and all the mixes for the rest of your life. Once you understand it and once you hear it, you'll never be able to go back. I'll see you over there. And now, as always, go create.